All right. Welcome back to another episode of Dr. America with your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. Dr. Sriram isn't here right this second. I'm his executive producer, Peter James Callahan. We actually had the great opportunity of joining Families USA and a ton of great people and experts and policy wonks and advocates and healthcare consumers just like you at Families USA Radio Row last week. And so you'll be hearing from a congressman, a constitutional law expert, and an ambassador to the EU and other things, talking about how healthcare works. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss it. And after this break, you'll hear some more from Dr. Sriram coming up right now.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Welcome back, everybody. Here we are with the React Radio Network at Families USA Radio Row. Today, the Supreme Court heard arguments about King versus Burwell. This is the latest threat to the Affordable Care Act. And to give us some more perspective on it, I'm very excited to introduce our next guest, Congressman Paul Tonko. He's the fourth-term member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and he represents New York's 20th Congressional District. That includes the cities of Albany, Schenectady, and his hometown of Amsterdam.
Right.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us.
Dr. Sriram, good to join you. And thank you for the good work you provide for the area here in Washington.
Oh, thank you. And so, Congressman, I see here that you're a member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. So that means that you had a front row seat to the Affordable Care Act when it was in its early stages.
Well, I got onto Energy and Commerce in the last two terms.
Okay.
But during the construct of the Affordable Care Act, I was on education and workforce as a committee assignment. And, of course, there were a number of things that came before that committee for approval. So we had a very straightforward role in that effort, and tried to make certain also that the mental health component of well-being was also addressed fully in the Affordable Care Act. So there were a number of opportunities we had to contribute to the final package.
Great. So, I'm really glad to have you on the show because I think it's really helpful for our listeners to hear from someone who, was so closely involved and can give us some idea of, what was Congress's intent. We keep hearing about the intent of Congress when it comes to, did they intend for these tax subsidies to make it to the federal exchanges or not?
Sorry, Jack, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, go for it. I'd love to hear, what was Congress's intent?
Well, let me offer two bits of awareness. Certainly, Square One told us that small business, and we have in this country an employer-based system, coverage system, small business was paying 18% on average more than industry, and oftentimes getting lesser service, lesser programming, lesser responsiveness in healthcare. Many small businesses were dropping coverage for their employees. They didn't want to. They couldn't afford it. Many people in our country were without insurance. So think of that as the starting base, and it was just unsustainable to continue that way. Status quo simply would not cut it. Also, there was a desire in the House, I believe, by a great many of us, to provide for health care as a right, not a privilege, and that human right is a very resounding one. We're the last industrialized nation in the world.
That's right.
To not provide that kind of access and affordability. So they assumed with that affordability comes the responsibility to sign up in the program. Second of all, they wanted to undo these pre-existing conditions. And finally, we wanted to provide universally income assistance, tax credits for anyone who would qualify so that people could afford if they were economically unable to. So in my mind, the desire here was pretty well implied.
Right.
It was across the board, whether it's a state exchange or a federally constructed exchange. across the board, universally, they were speaking of providing assistance, affordability, accessibility, quality.
And so that that kind of brings us to King versus Burwell, and the Supreme Court's hearing arguments today about it. Now, let's say they decide to side with the plaintiffs, and these tax subsidies have a harder time making it to those federal exchanges. What does that mean for our fellow Americans?
Well, I think it affects everybody, whether you're in a federal exchange or a state exchange. I think that the impact will be felt because it's an industry-wide across the country effect. You'd probably see in the reports that I've read and the projections that have been scored, we'd probably see somewhere between 45 and 50% increase in premiums. You would probably see some 8 million people, over 8 million people, knocked off the rolls of healthcare coverage. That would be a dreadful outcome. It would be an economic step backward at a time when we're trying to grow the economy. With this system, there's a growth of service that's provided, and so there's an economic value added to it. And again, I would hope that the United States Supreme Court, highest court in the land, across the street from where we sit, I would hope a moral compass would guide their actions. Fact and justice here will speak to, I think, keeping the ACA intact and keeping the credits available for federally covered exchanges. If that doesn't do it, I would hope the moral compass would resonate loud and clearly
and
to people.
I really, really appreciate your emphasis on facts, justice, and that moral compass, because that really is what comes to my mind when I look at the Affordable Care Act over the last 5 years. What have you noticed as some of the big highlights, especially in areas of mental health?
Certainly. Well, I see a lot of people getting coverage for mental health purposes that didn't before the act. I see a number of seniors favorably treated by the Affordable Care Act. There are those prescription services where the ACA took the donut hole. That was the out-of-pocket expenses to a senior. Many are combating cancer. Many are under for life medications because of heart conditions, high blood pressure, post-stroke. So the pharmaceutical impact on the senior community is profound. And what they saw in closing that donut hole was economic relief that was already beginning. We'll finally close that donut hole in 2020. I also hear from families where their young adults are staying on for coverage, which was very important. So many of the startup companies that young people may find employment at, or even some of the companies that are long-standing, aren't offering the young crowd healthcare. So that bridge with the family policy up to the age of 26, critically important. Also, the free annual checkups for the senior community, the wellness initiatives, the underscoring of prevention, that and a number of services provided without a requirement of out-of-pocket have been strong statements, and the one that I think it resonates so well when it comes to economic and social justice, and that's combating pre-existing conditions. For people to have been denied coverage because of pre-existing conditions is deplorable in a nation like ours that prides itself on justice.
Absolutely.
And when people hear that phraseology, pre-existing condition, they're thinking perhaps a severe case of chronic illness. It can be as slight as toddler acne.
Oh, I've heard about
or
that.
Or a pregnant woman can be deemed pre-existing
having had a
condition.
C-section before.
So let's stop the foolishness. Let's have sanity be the rule, and let's have the moral compass resonate in every decision made, and hopefully that truth and justice will be served. Will be embraced and then served to the people of this country by understanding that the spirit of the law, and certainly implied forcefully, is that tax credits be available to those who qualify across the country, no matter what sort of coverage.
And I really appreciate that, because with all the Americans that you're describing, it feels like I keep hearing peace of mind. Like peace of mind in so many different ways for so many different people, and it's striking to me that we are finally helping families escape that false choice of their health or their finances but because in the previous system they couldn't have both.
Well, the number one, before the Affordable Care Act, the number one reason for bankruptcy for families was health care costs. And are we a society that prides itself on having an empty mayonnaise jar on a convenience store counter, asking for any loose change you have to go towards a neighbor who is struggling with cancer? Is that the society we've come to know?
Right.
When we have possibilities here of guaranteed, statutorily required components of a law that speak with dignity to the individual and allow us to do the economically sound thing. Because, these cases aren't going away, as as a pediatrician, if there's not a health care insurance coverage, they will be addressed at that local hospital.
Right.
And that's where these costs are going to go, to the hospitals and the employers who are providing the employer-based health care coverage.
Right.
So let's not kid ourselves. There's a ripple effect here, and it swings from one venue to another, and again, doesn't speak poignantly, forcefully to quality of life and dignity of the individuals and families that call America home.
Right. And, just like you were pointing out, I mean, a lot of these families, it's not that they're going to stop, seeking health care. They're going to keep seeking it, but they're going to be seeking it at the worst possible time when a condition has progressed or worsened.
Well, I had a constituent verbalize quite strongly at me during the development stages of the Affordable Care Act about taking care of indigent, uninsured or underinsured folks. And I said, look, if you don't do that, if you don't address it in the emergency room or wherever at a local hospital, the other choice is to is to have the person just get unattended. I said, so what would you want? He said, let them die. They should have had insurance. And I said, you know what? If that's what you want in a representative, you got the wrong person.
Well, good for you, sir. Thank you so much for saying that. Oh, wow. Mr. Congressman, I'm really proud of you for that one. Thank you.
Thanks.
And, and have you heard back from any of your other constituents about how this law is helping them?
Oh, a number of people have said, look, you've got over 10 million people added to the healthcare rolls. You've got uninsured, and underinsured percentages of the population to their lowest level, perhaps historically. You've got the slightest growth in healthcare costs in over 50 years, and you've got premiums reduced by some 70 to 75%. That's what I hear from a number of people. And even those who may have some problems or many problems with the Affordable Care Act, they bring it to me with a constructive bit of input. And most of the people with whom I interact in the district, and we hear from many, will suggest no repeal, improve.
Okay.
So, and the problem I've had with the Republican majority in the House of Representatives that has asked me some 57 or 8 times over to repeal, there's never a replacement measure. So if we repeal, we're back to square one, and you're now taking all the progress that was achieved, and it's plentiful, and you're denying that.
And, I want to kind of follow up on that. So with King versus Burwell, we've got about 8 to 9 million Americans who could potentially lose their insurance if the tax subsidies don't make it to the federal exchange. Have you heard from any of your colleagues about a backup plan at all?
No, we keep asking for a replacement plan because they're the agents of repeal, and there's never a constructive response.
So over 50, like you said, 57 going on 58 votes.
Yeah, it's 57 or 8
to repeal the law. They've had all these opportunities for a replacement. They know what the consequences are going to be if King versus Burwell, goes unfavorably. Still no backup plan?
Yeah, I think all that theater, political theater, renders itself as a personal attack on individuals. It's primarily the president, his administration, and the leadership in the past. It's just, I think, playing political games with a process. This is too important. This is a right, not a privilege. It's about life and death choices at times. It's about a dignity factor. It's about providing hope, delivering hope to the doorsteps of individuals. And it should be about who we believe we are as an American as a country, as the United States of America. And sometimes that's put aside just for the sake of political theater, and I find that regrettable. That's disingenuous, and it's not us at our best.
Right. It's so inconsistent with I think the American values that kind of unite all of us, regardless of our political stripes.
Well, so many times we like to wax as the best out there in the world, and I think we've got a number of situations that make us the best. When it came to healthcare, we were lagging behind. And so let's just shine our image. Let's produce good results for the people who enjoy this American experience. Let's make it even more enjoyable and more fair, more importantly.
Absolutely. So let's look at the other side of the coin. If the Supreme Court decides to rule in favor of the Affordable Care Act and these tax subsidies continue to make it to the federal exchange, what do you feel are kind of the next challenges, or like the next on the to-do list for American healthcare and policy?
Well, I think that we should provide bulk purchasing of pharmaceuticals. That's been denied for many of the federal programs. I thought that was a mistake. There was a guarantee that was made, some sort of write-off with the company. I think that we need to go back and revisit that issue and provide for bulk purchasing where we could save immense amount of dollars by doing that. I think some of the tax credits need to be further extended. To run them for 2-3 years doesn't quite do it. And to raise that threshold of small business from, I believe it's 25 to 50. Let more businesses qualify with the tax credits. If they're indeed ruled fair and acceptable or justifiable, then let's build upon that success. And let's make certain that we really get this engine of healthcare insurance coverage as powerful as it can be, because it drives our competitiveness as a nation.
Right.
Businesses will have healthier workforces, they'll have reduced costs, we'll be able to go forward and enable them to more effectively compete in an innovation economy that is global in scope and that requires us to have every cost we can bleed out of the system so that they can, again, not be burdened with it.
Right. And, a lot of what you're talking about, it sounds like, we're trying to, help, working Americans and these businesses that are right there, they're trying to, get the foot out of the, out of the recession.
Yep.
They're trying to, be part of the economic recovery. And so some of the ideas that you're talking about with, extending the tax credits to, slightly larger businesses that have, going from 25 to 50, and extending that time frame, those are huge reliefs to to Americans that are just coming out of this recession, right?
Absolutely. And I think also beyond the framework of the Affordable Care Act, there is a need in this country for this country to invest more deeply in research. I've seen the research potential for Alzheimer's, for many neurological dysfunctions and disorders and diseases. So if we can invest heavily, as the president has asked with the Study of the Brain initiative that he's advanced, as a trained medical doctor, that there's great awareness and potential hope that is secured by unlocking some of these doors that allow not only for the specific research of that specific disease to be accomplished, but it then translates into several disorders and diseases that can be addressed simultaneously. So we have, I think, reduced sometimes our commitment to research or not enhanced it well enough.
Right.
So to complement the Affordable Care Act, I say let's invest in research, medical research that will enable us to harvest that intellectual capacity that we invested in this country through all sorts of sophisticated degrees. Put that intellect, that American intellect, to work in these labs to come up with the help we require.
Right. And it sounds like there'd be so many manifold benefits of that kind of investment, because obviously as a pediatrician, I would love to see some of my kids who've suffered traumatic brain injuries or spinal cord injuries benefit from something like that. But I feel like there's also some opportunities for entrepreneurs and researchers to actually be economically competitive. So what are the obstacles that we're facing with something that sounds so common sense?
Political will.
Oh, wow.
If the mantra that guides us these days is government's the enemy, our government's too big, we're spending too much. And if you look at you can document where the domestic investment, the domestic agenda has been reduced. We seem to find money for war, but we don't find money for a domestic agenda, for the people at home who require investments from education all the way up to healthcare.
Right. And, the sad thing is that, for many of our, men and women in service who are coming back from, those wars, they would stand to benefit from, from us learning more about the brain and its effects on PTSD and, when it comes to mental health coverage and improving it and building that workforce.
Absolutely. And proof in the pudding again, look at the numbers of suicides in the military. They surpass the numbers of deaths on the battlefield. And so much of that is driven by, I think, the damage of war.
Right.
The post-traumatic stress, many of the situations that impact people and their mental health.
And so, I find it so, puzzling to me, as a physician and, just even as an American citizen when I look at, such a simple connecting of the dots, right? Like everything that we've been talking about so far with, mental health coverage, mental health, providing mental health care with, the people who need it, be those, children with, with rare disorders, our elderly with Alzheimer's, our, veterans with all kinds of different injuries, and research. Right. And, these dots are not that hard to connect. Is the political will so hard to overcome to make this picture come together?
I'm one of the few engineers on the Hill in Washington, and to me it's all about planning, constantly updating that plan and routinely implementing it. And these efforts that you just highlighted, from research to to mental health and making, and by the way, I was a big champion in the New York State Legislature where I served for 25 years. One of my favorite successes was getting mental health parity across the finish line. Oh. And I think we were the first state to do that.
Oh, wow.
But, bringing about, again, parity between mental health and general physical well-being is important, along with, the accessibility and affordability. So all of these issues are woven together.
Right.
And they create a tapestry that speaks to the soundness, the health soundness of our nation. And that serves everybody well.
Right.
It's the economically wise thing to do, but more importantly, it's the human mission that ought to be fought for and accomplished.
And I'm glad that you brought up mental health parity, because I feel like one of the overlooked accomplishments of the Affordable Care Act is the efforts that it's making to build equity and equality into our into our healthcare system for women, for people with pre-existing conditions, for mental health. Could you speak a little bit more on that and just sort of give us an idea of where we've been and where we could be going?
Sure. Well, one of the interesting things is that after all the battles are done in the Congress, in the House passing the bill over to the Senate or vice versa, after all that effort and all that consensus building, there's, of course, the signature by the president, but it doesn't end there. When a bill becomes a law, gets signed into law, then you have the promulgation of rules and regs that will take the spirit and letter of the law and apply it into programs. So we have been very actively involved, making certain that parity is absolutely drafted the way it was intended, and that we are not slipping in that effort. And when it comes to the health of women, the general well-being of women, here's an audience that really should support the Affordable Care Act because of so many of the concerns of prenatal care that were addressed, the pre-existing conditions that could be labeled onto a woman who's carrying a child, bearing a fetus. All of these things were addressed favorably, and we're going to continue to do that. We're going to, as we have hearings on women's health or hearings on the 21st Century Care Act, what are those growing issues? What are the potentials that are developing? Let's get them done, and let's go forward and be proud of the academic prowess that we're encouraging as it relates to patients.
Right.
And I'm certain that your healing touch, the joy in your job is being successful, relieving pain, saving lives. Those are the joyful moments. And that's what the Affordable Care Act is focused on. If we need to fine-tune, let's do it, but do not repeal.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today,
My pleasure.
Congressman. Really appreciated talking with you. This was a great discussion, and hopefully the Supreme Court will, take this obstacle out of our path to health justice.
As a provider out there, Dr. Sriram, I'm so impressed that you would be doing the public advocacy, the public information exchange. That's indeed very critical. So thank you for two capacities.
Oh,
for
thank
being
you.
a voice for reason and for being the hands of healing.
Oh, happy to.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, sir.
Okay, my pleasure.
All right. Well, you guys have been listening to the We Act Radio Network. We are so glad to have had Congressman Tonko to join us on the program. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Welcome back, everyone. You're listening to the We Act Radio Network here at Families USA's Radio Row. Today, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments about King versus Burwell. This is the most recent threat to the Affordable Care Act. And to help us make sense of the legal logistics, I'm really excited for our next guest. We have Mr. Ian Millhiser. He is a senior fellow over at the Center for American Progress and has a lot of amazing expertise about constitutional law and has done some incredible work around constitutional law and the Supreme Court. He has a new book coming out, and it's called Injustices: The Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted. I'm definitely going to be reading this when it comes out real soon. All right, so Ian, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much.
So Ian, one of the things that I'm kind of curious about when it comes to looking at King versus Burwell, because I've done my public health policy kind of work, and I've looked at the argument that they're trying to make, and I don't really believe in the strength of their argument. I mean, I'm actually kind of surprised that this has made it this far.
Right.
So, can you help us understand why it's come this far?
Right.
How did it even get to this many judges and all the way to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, no, it's surprised a lot of us that it's made it this far. I mean, basically what this comes down to is whether this is a case about law or whether this is a case about politics.
Okay.
So if it's a case about law, the legal issue here is that the Affordable Care Act says that there's some exchanges that are run by the federal government, some that are run by state governments. A state gets to choose which one they want.
Right.
And this lawsuit claims that if you live in one of the states that chose a federally run exchange, you are not allowed to get your share of hundreds of billions of dollars worth of tax credits that help people pay for their health insurance. So that's their theory. They base it on 6 words of the law. The law refers at one point to an exchange established by the state. Mm-hmm. And they claim that those 6 words mean that only exchanges that are state-run and not federally run are allowed to provide these tax credits.
Okay.
The problem with their argument is that the Affordable Care Act is actually a lot longer than 6 words. It's about 1,000 pages long.
Right.
And the word exchange is defined in a way so that it means that state and federal exchanges are basically the exact same thing. There are various provisions of the law that become absurd if you read the law the way they read it. So, for example, the provision dealing with who is allowed to buy and who is allowed to sell health insurance also refers to the state that established the exchange. So if an exchange established by the state only doesn't include the federally run exchanges, then that means that the federally run exchanges aren't allowed to buy no one's allowed to buy health insurance in them, and no one's allowed to sell health insurance in them.
Huh, okay.
So, why would you design a law that sets up this whole complicated and expensive apparatus and then say, oh, but no one's allowed to use it?
Right. So, I guess that, and so before it actually came to the Supreme Court, it's actually been in front of other judges before. Right. So, how have those judges, heard out the plaintiffs, and why have the plaintiffs had, their success and, lack thereof with judges before?
Yeah. So the majority of judges to hear the case have upheld the tax credits. But here's the scary thing. With one exception, every single judge that struck down the tax credit was appointed by a Republican president. And that's why I say that this comes down to whether it's a case or about law or a case about politics. If it's about law, like the plaintiffs, they just don't have a legal argument on their side.
Right.
But if it's about politics, if it's a question of, well, like, some of the judges are going to say, well, I'm a Republican and Republicans don't much like Obamacare.
Right.
Then we're in a lot of trouble in the Supreme Court because there are 5 Republican justices and only 4 Democrats.
Now, is that like something that is like common in like, in the legal culture? I mean, like, have previous like court cases depended on, like how well liked a, president and his domestic policies are?
Yeah.
Is that something that we've seen before?
Well, I mean, I guess if I can practice psychology without a license here, there's a lot of research into the human brain.
Okay.
Studying a phenomenon called motivated reasoning, where like if people really want something to be true, we have a tendency to convince ourselves it's true. And that's not unique to Democrats or Republicans or anything. Like we all do this thing where if we want something bad enough, we come to believe it. Well, Republicans really, really badly want to believe that there's a way to get rid of Obamacare. And so that's what I think makes this lawsuit scary. Is it comes, does Chief Justice Roberts believe badly enough that he wants to get rid of this thing that he's willing to let his brain think that a lawsuit that has no grounding in the law is viable? Is Justice Kennedy willing to do that? Is Justice Scalia willing to do that? And that's why we are here. Like, if they simply look at the law and they read the whole law and not just these 6 words, then the law is upheld and everything stays fine.
And that's actually like, I mean, how, Justice Scalia has approached, some of these kinds of issues before is that he's not, like, at least my understanding is that he's not a fan of, like, taking, like, a few words or a passage or even a page out of a multi-page, voluminous law and making everything hinge on that. Like, and that's conservative Justice Scalia with that perspective.
That's exactly right. I mean, Scalia published a book a few years ago about how to read laws. And what he said is that when you're trying to figure out what a law means, you don't look at... In fact, he said that one of the biggest errors that judges sometimes make is that they make the mistake of reading a passage in isolation, when in fact you have to look at the whole law, the context those words appear in, what their position is in the overall scheme that the law is trying to establish. And so what I want the Supreme Court to do in this case is do exactly what Justice Scalia says they should do. Just read the whole thing. And once you do that, it becomes clear that these people don't have a case. Why on earth are they in front of the Supreme Court of the United States?
And so I guess I mean, like, how do you feel about the other the other justices? Because I know that, like, I mean, last time it was surprising to hear that it was the Chief Justice Roberts was like the hinge vote who changed his mind apparently very late into the game. Do we have like any idea about like where we're at with the other justices?
So here's why I think people are watching the Chief Justice very closely. There's a sense, and I mean not just like a sense like pundits say it. Like there's a sense among a lot of legal experts and like people who know the chief that he's conflicted because he's a very, very conservative guy, but he's also very concerned about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court as an institution. And if the court on the single most partisan, most contested issue in the country, if the court decides to reach out and neuter the most contentious law and on partisan grounds in my lifetime, and to do it on the basis of a legal theory that has no basis in the language of the law or anything that I can recognize as law. All of a sudden the court itself looks suspect. If they're willing to do that, if they're willing to let 13 million people lose their health insurance and as many as 10,000 people a year die on the basis of this nonsense legal theory,
Right.
then like you start to wonder, why should we have these guys? Why should they wield this power in the first place? It begins to indict the legitimacy of the Supreme Court as an institution.
So now we're talking about public health consequences, and where public health consequences meet the legal and political cultural
Right.
consequences of some of our most important institutions.
Right.
And so so that's Chief Justice Roberts, and then I've heard that another justice who's tough to predict is Kennedy.
Right.
And what's your take with his previous work with these kinds of contentious laws and where he might go?
So Kennedy's tough. So the thing with Kennedy, the last time the Affordable Care Act was before the Supreme Court, he was the one who was apparently lobbying Roberts the hardest to try to bring him back into the Republican fold and get him to vote to strike down the law.
Okay.
Kennedy does not like this law. And that's a problem. We'd want him to follow the law, but Kennedy tends to be very driven by his instincts. And his instincts are very conservative. Mm-hmm. That said, I think there's two things that we can look for with Justice Kennedy. One is that there's a very interesting, I think very strong argument that if the plaintiffs are right, that there's this hidden punishment for the citizens of states that didn't set up their own exchange. Mm-hmm. There's a really strong argument that violates constitutional protections for states.
Right.
And Kennedy is a states' rights guy. He cares a lot about, federalism is the term that lawyers use. He cares a lot about, the constitutional prerogatives of states, not just being protected, but expanded. And so if he's willing to set aside this disdain that he has for this individual law, mm-hmm. he could score a big victory here for something that he's cared about his entire career.
And maintain some integrity for his legal philosophy.
Exactly. The other thing with Justice Kennedy is that he has a record of when he believes that the welfare of children is at stake.
Okay.
Of crossing over and voting with the court's liberal bloc. He did that in a school prayer case, and it's clear from his opinion that he thought the fact that these were school children and not adults mm-hmm. Called for greater protections under the Constitution's protections for separation of church and state. If you go back and you read his comments in the marriage equality cases when they were being argued a few years ago, he talked almost as much about the kids as he did about the parents. It was clear that the thing that, and he cast a solid pro-marriage equality vote in Windsor. It was clear that a big thing that inspired him was that it wasn't necessarily that he was concerned, he might have been concerned about these parents who were being denied their rights, but he was very concerned about these children who had to grow up in a household where they were told that their parents were somehow second class, that, it was demeaning to them, it led to them, questioning their own worth with their peers, and, he's just very concerned with the welfare of children.
So doesn't it stand to reason, though, that, we're kind of in a similar situation where, now, these same kids are going to be, looking at parents, struggle to keep,
right.
their finances afloat because they have to afford health insurance, they have to afford their rent or their mortgage, they have to afford groceries, Isn't this more or less, kind of a similar circumstance?
Well, here's how I think the children thing works to our advantage with Kennedy. And it also raises the stakes a great deal in this lawsuit. So the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, mm-hmm. provides close to 8 million children with health insurance. That predates the Affordable Care Act.
Sure.
There's a provision of the Affordable Care Act, though, that says that if CHIP is ever not funded and it comes up for renewal in September, that the exchanges will provide a backstop so that those children get to continue to be insured. That provision uses the same language though, that the exchange established by the state. So now, maybe Congress will renew funding in September, but have you seen this Congress?
Right. Cooperation is not exactly
it's not their
work
thing.
Ethic, right.
And if they don't, then the backstop is supposed to be these exchanges.
Right.
But under the plaintiff's theory, if the plaintiffs win in King, then the exchanges are not allowed to provide for these children if they are in a state with a federally run exchange. So 5 million children will lose their health care in September unless this Congress, which like is barely able to fund the Department of Homeland Security,
right.
is gets off its butts and does something.
Right.
And so, given Kennedy's concern for the welfare of children, I'm hopeful that he'll realize that, maybe I should just go ahead and follow the law here.
Right.
Because I don't want 5 million kids to suffer.
Right. So, kind of trying to, connect this to, your book, which is, seems to cover like a history of the Supreme Court and its rulings. So let's say that, like for this particular case of King v. Burwell, if the Supreme Court rules in favor of the plaintiffs, how does that fit into the historical context of Supreme Court rulings? Is this like one of the worst that they've ever like ruled, or would it be one that's like kind of medium? Like where would you grade it compared to other Supreme Court rulings?
It's hard to put things on a scale of evil, but I mean you have to go back really far to find a case that is as nasty and mean-spirited as this one. I mean you have to go back probably to the Korematsu decision, the Japanese internment case. And that's because, so the history that I lay out in my book, the Supreme Court's history is nasty. There's Dred Scott, the slavery decision. We ratified 3 constitutional amendments to get rid of Dred Scott, and the Supreme Court more or less wrote them out of the Constitution over the next 30 years. That's how we got Jim Crow.
Right.
Then for the next 40 years, they rewrote one of those amendments to strike down things like the minimum wage, to make it impossible to unionize. At one point, they struck down child labor laws. And while they were doing that, they were also doing things like saying that a woman could be cut open and sterilized against her will.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they actually upheld a eugenics program. So that was the Supreme Court we had. And then Roosevelt went to war with the Supreme Court. And he appointed a bunch of justices who... Roosevelt was not a civil libertarian. His goal was to make sure that the Supreme Court basically just didn't interfere with them. He wanted them to do a lot of nothing.
Right.
One of the nothings that they didn't do is they didn't stop Japanese concentration camps. That was the Korematsu case. The Warren Court, which is the era that we normally think of as the ascendance of liberalism, was a huge accident.
Oh, okay.
I mean, Eisenhower, who appointed Earl Warren, later said it was the biggest damn fool mistake he ever made. Those were his words, because he thought that he didn't know that Warren would be a liberal.
Okay.
He said the same thing about Justice Brennan, who was the other big liberal justice that he appointed. Justice Hugo Black, who wound up being one of the biggest advocates for the Brown v. Board decision, he was in the Ku Klux Klan. He was a senator from Alabama, and after he got on the Supreme Court, he had a change of heart. But, you wouldn't have predicted that from his record.
Right.
And there's a bunch of other examples of this that I lay out in Injustices, of cases where someone got on who turned out to be a big surprise, or, there was a person who wanted to do terrible things on the issue of race who did not get confirmed, and that led to someone else getting that seat who voted the right way in Brown. If it wasn't for a bunch of historic accidents, Brown would have gone the other way. And ever since Earl Warren retired in 1969, the court has been sliding deeper and deeper back into the way that it used to be.
Okay.
And that's what scares me about this King decision, is it could be the culmination of this process that takes us through Citizens United and the money in elections, that takes us through the decision to strike down the Voting Rights Act, that takes us through all of these terrible things that the Roberts Courts has done. And, to then rip health care away from 13 million people, that is a monstrosity akin to these cases of the past that are doing things like striking down child labor laws. Then we are suddenly, re-entering this era like what I lay out in Injustices, where the court sees itself as, sees its role as protecting preventing the elected branches from protecting the most vulnerable.
Wow. Well, I think that this has been, a fascinating, this has just been such a fascinating education, in just like a few minutes of like actually kind of understanding King v. Burwell from like from a legal historical standpoint, just because I think that so far, we have been rightfully concerned about the public health consequences, but to understand that we have actually an opportunity to maintain some kind of legal integrity, to kind of maintain some basic values about like how we look out for each other as Americans when it comes to our health. And I guess like kind of looking, we've been looking in the past so far. When you look forward, are there like cases that we should be like keeping an eye on in the lower courts that could be the next threat of Obamacare? Are we going to be having the same conversation together next year, you think?
They are going to keep throwing things at this wall. I mean, and like with each lawsuit, it gets more and more absurd. There's a lawsuit making its way up through the Fifth Circuit, which claims that the law had to originate in the House and it originated in the Senate, and therefore that makes the entire law unconstitutional. There is a lawsuit brought by various members of Congress that basically tries to raise the cost of participating in the law for health insurance companies so that fewer companies will participate and so that premiums will go up. This is why I think the first case trying to kill Obamacare, the 2012 case, that was a ridiculous legal theory too. I mean, the idea that a law that regulates 1/6 of the nation's economy isn't a regulation of commerce. Try to get your head around that for a second. Right. So that was ridiculous in and of itself. And here's what I think happened. The other side likes to bluster. And in public, they'll talk about how, it's obvious that they should have won that case. They think it's obvious they should win this King case. That's what they'll say in public. But their lawyers are smart. Their lawyers are smart enough to know that they've now thrown 2 Hail Marys. And come pretty close to connecting on both of them. And when the Supreme Court starts saying, starts letting you throw those Hail Marys and sometimes lets you catch them, it's a good way for the court to signal, why don't you throw some more things at the wall? We'll see what other ridiculous theories you can come up with. And that's what scares me, is that the court seems to be signaling to conservative activists to bring whatever lawsuit they can think of, no matter how outlandish the theory. And every now and then, sometimes they'll only get 4 justices. Sometimes they say yes.
Yeah.
The Hobby Lobby case that was just cited, the birth control case. Before Hobby Lobby, there was a simple rule for religious liberty. My religious liberty stops at your body. I'm allowed. I have a tremendous amount of freedom, but I can't use my rights to take away your rights. Hobby Lobby is the first case that I know of where the Supreme Court said that if I object to something on religious grounds, in that case it was birth control, that if I object to birth control on religious grounds, I can take away your birth control. Or more likely I can take away the birth control of the women who work for me. And that's just not something that previous decisions had allowed. Previous decisions recognized that our rights have to stop somewhere, and that place where it stops is someone else's rights.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Ian, because this was, just a fascinating discussion. I think it's been, really helpful to, reframe, King versus Burwell into this historical perspective. And hopefully we can, see some positive, health outcomes and, legal outcomes. And, I thank you very much for joining us on the program today.
All right. Thank you.
All right. All right, everybody, you've been listening to the We Act Radio Network. We're here at Families USA's Radio Row. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be right back.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
welcome back, everyone. You're listening to the We Act Radio Network. We are at Families USA's Radio Row. Today, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments about King versus Burwell. It's the latest threat to the Affordable Care Act. And I'm really excited for the perspectives of our next guest. We have Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt with us today. He is a former President Carter domestic policy advisor. He was a former Clinton Deputy Treasury Secretary, and he's the former U.S. Ambassador to the European Union. We're really excited to have you on the show today, sir.
Thank you, Doctor.
All right. So Ambassador, I was kind of wondering about your experiences working under the Carter administration, where I understand you got to actually build a pretty good friendship with Senator Kennedy and on health insurance, specifically. So can you share that with us and how that relates to the Affordable Care Act?
So during the 1976 presidential campaign, when I was the president's policy advisor, we committed to a national health insurance program with the UAW. In the administration, I negotiated for weeks on end, just across the street here at the Capitol, with Senator Kennedy. And we had everything agreed. How it would be financed, each phase that would occur and over how many periods of years. And then when I brought it back to the White House, the president's economic advisors said, well, we have very high inflation and interest rates. The markets will react very negatively to a new entitlement. Let's insist that each phase would only go into effect if the president said that we could afford it economically. And I knew that was going to be a poison pill for Senator Kennedy, so he didn't accept it. We then came back with a first phase $17 billion program, and we're talking about 1980. That's a lot of money. We were going to cover an expanded Medicaid population, all children, you're a pediatrician, all children, and catastrophic care. Senator Kennedy said no, it's got to be comprehensive or nothing. So we lost that opportunity. It was lost again in the Clinton administration. Now we finally have it. Now I saw when I was ambassador to the European Union what difference it makes to have universal coverage.
Right, because you got to travel to
I went
the industrialized
the length
world,
and the length and breadth
we're
of
the only
Europe.
industrialized country that has struggled with this.
It's
issue.
not only that, but people who say, well, how can we afford it? In Europe, which has universal coverage, they spend 8% of their total GDP on healthcare. With our spotty coverage, which would be made much worse if the Supreme Court goes the wrong way here, we spend 16% of our GDP, twice that.
Wow.
But it's not just a GDP figure. I could see through the people I met, through colleagues and friends that I made, and that what my wife Fran made, what difference it made to their comfort level to know that if they or their relatives, families, their children, their spouses got sick, that they would be covered. I can even give you a personal example. When my cousin, Marsha Micah, came from Atlanta to visit us in Brussels, and my wife and I drove with she and some other cousins to Paris, and on our way back, she got ill. Okay. We went to a small hospital outside of Paris. With no questions asked, she was treated. When she left about 8 hours later, no bill. And it demonstrated to me what it means to be in a country that has universal coverage and how much we lose, how much anxiety, how much pain and suffering is exacted when a mother can't care for her children or parents for their young kids or younger families for their aging parents. It's a tragedy. And this legislation finally, going back to President Truman, who first proposed it over 65 years ago, we finally have it, and it can be taken away with the stroke of a pen.
Right. So, actually, I wanted to kind of learn more about, your travels in the EU, because it sounds like, that we are exceptional as Americans in having these false choices between it's going to be either our finances or our health, because, that seems to be what a lot of families are struggling with. Now, in your travels, European families, are they, do they seem to be any less free or any less, able to pursue their,
They're more free. They're free of fear. They're free of concern about what happens if they or their loved ones get sick.
Because they're not going to go broke when
They're not going to go broke. They're not going to have to dig into their savings. They're not going to have to choose between paying for food and paying for education on the one hand and paying for health care on the other. It's an enormous sense of freedom, of liberation from fear. And the quality of their care in Europe is very good. The doctors are very good. You don't see doctors leaving Europe to come elsewhere because of the healthcare system. They accept the system. They like the system. Now, interestingly, here in the United States, one of the big arguments was single payer, in other words, the government, as in Europe, or private. All right, we adopted a quintessential, and this is what President Obama proposed, and this is what we propose in the current administration, a quintessential American solution. In effect, a public-private partnership, but where most of the system is private.
Right.
And the insurance is private. The insurance companies are the greatest supporters of Obamacare and are the most concerned about what the implications are of this decision, because you could throw up to 8 million people out on the streets without insurance and raise the premiums on everybody else.
Right.
So we've adopted in the Affordable Care Act a uniquely American private sector system, and yet now that also is at risk.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we have these risks, but it doesn't sound like there's a backup plan coming from either the administration or from Congress. If you had to put on that domestic policy advisor hat again, what would you advise?
Well, first of all, I think the reason the administration hasn't adopted a backup plan is because they don't want to take the heat off the Supreme Court. The reason the Republicans haven't is they don't want the coverage to begin with. But it's a double whammy, Doctor. The very states that decided not to have state exchanges and whose citizens, as a result of getting the federal subsidies, may be the ones thrown out of coverage, are the same states whose governors decided not to extend Medicaid. So those people are hit twice.
Right.
The lowest income people don't have an expansion of Medicaid. The working people, and almost all the people, we're talking about 80-85% of the people who would be thrown out of coverage, 5 to 8 million people, are working people in those same states.
Right.
So one would hope that the Republicans in those states, the governors and the members of Congress, would say, well, wait a minute, we really didn't intend this. We don't want this to occur. And yet when we see the political polarization over things that should be as simple as funding the Department of Homeland Security to protect us, or the Highway Trust Fund to fill our potholes and build new highways and roads and bridges and rapid transit lines, and we can't get that funded. We realize on something that's been so controversial since Harry Truman's presidency, to think that suddenly there's going to be love and consensus breaking out is, I'm afraid, a forlorn hope. Now, if I were political domestic advisor again, I would be very quietly proposing some alternatives, but the notion that it will lead to a consensus is quite another story.
So, I mean, as we look ahead, just for the sake of, I think as policy wonks, as the kind of people who really care about making sure that people can, see the doctor, let's envision a scenario where the Supreme Court does side with the plaintiffs. Do you think that there's a shot at the public option coming up again? Is that something that you think could be proposed? Is that
No, I mean, there's no way in which we're going to go back to a single-payer system. In many respects, it would be the easiest, but look, the insurance companies are the strongest supporters of the Affordable Care Act. They're the ones who are most concerned in some respects, beside the consumer and low-income people and moderate-income people, about the Supreme Court's potential decision. But it's impossible in this country to go back. It's just beating your head against the wall, and there's no point in doing it.
So, let's try to, I guess, look at the more optimistic picture where the Supreme Court supports the Affordable Care Act and the tax subsidies are still going to the federal exchanges. What do you feel are, maybe the next steps that we can take on building the foundation that the Affordable Care Act has given us?
Well, I mean, there would still be elements of the Affordable Care Act left. Those, for example, who are in states with an expanded Medicaid. Those who are in states that have a state exchange. But the problem is that this is an integrated system, and if the implications are that you throw 8 million people out of coverage in the states without state exchanges, that's going to mean that the more healthy people who needed the subsidies will say, look, we've had it, we can't afford it. So it would leave the less healthy people with insurance. That will raise premiums for all of us, for you and for me. So the implications go far beyond just the 5 to 8 million people. We're talking about everyone facing this ripple effect.
So these are some major ripple effects.
It's a huge ripple effect.
And so, do you feel that so we don't have a backup plan, and we've got these major, ripple effects. What should we do for the other, millions that are in that coverage gap? Because, that does, the Supreme Court doesn't really, their ruling one way or the other does not really help those Americans that are not in expanded Medicaid. So how would we advise those governors who are still resisting expanding Medicaid?
So I think that what one would say to them now, if the Supreme Court goes the wrong way, is to say it's on you to set up a state exchange. If you do, then the Supreme Court, again, I hope that they won't come to this, but if they say if you don't have a state exchange, you don't get covered, set your state exchange up. Give your people a chance to buy insurance.
And because it is actually, like you were saying, private sector friendly.
It's private sector. And while you're at it, go ahead and expand Medicaid and get 100% federal subsidy for it.
Right. And so that's been kind of interesting to me that this is like money that's actually being left on the table, at least from my perspective.
It's absolutely money left on the table. The federal government was willing to put 100% payment for 2 years and 90% for the balance forever for expanding Medicaid. And the notion that a governor would say to his own lowest income people, I don't want you to have expanded Medicaid coverage, it's just almost unfathomable.
Okay, well, hopefully, Ambassador, we're going to be looking at a much more optimistic Supreme Court ruling when they come back with their decision in June.
Well, as my mother would say, from your mouth to God's ear.
Well, thank you very much, sir, for joining us today. You guys have been listening to Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt here on the We Act Radio Network at Families USA's Radio Row.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.